On today's show, we have some tech app and some sports betting. For guests, we'll have joining us Matt Russell. He's a sports betting expert and the host of the Window Canada Sports Betting Podcast. And Mason Black, he's the creator of the NHL Rank King app. Hit the music. Welcome to Jablam Sports Hockey, folks. I'm your host, Peter Bojanov. You can find me on Twitter at Russian98. You can find the full show at Jablam Sports. If you have any questions or comments, please tweet us. Use the hashtag Jablam Sports, that's JABLAM Sports. Please subscribe to us if you haven't done so yet, and click on those three dots in your podcasting app. Share our show with 3 hockey fans you know. Thank you, everyone. Remember, check out our website, go to jablamsports.com to see all our podcasts and even game notes for every episode. We give you tidbits and things we mentioned on this episode. For our podcast, click on podcasts, then on hockey for this show specifically. We don't have a poll on today's episode, but please vote on them as we get closer to the play-in round. Again, you can use our Twitter account at Jablam Sports. We'll have some right before the play-in round and all throughout the playoffs. And time for some trending now. How's it going, Logan?
Good, how are you?
I'm great. Where can everybody find you?
At Hoagie99.
And let's get into it. The number one thing we want to talk about is players opting out. Before we go into a little bit of the list, are you surprised how short it is, how long it is?
I'm kind of surprised how short it is. It's only a handful of people. I kind of thought there might be at least one per team, so that would bring it up to like 30, close to 30, over 30 teams or 30 people. But it's way shorter than that. So
Mike Kitchen, the assistant coach of the Florida Panthers, has opted out. They tweeted out, and he said, "It was a difficult decision, to say the least, but the right decision for me and my family."
Mm-hmm.
Chris Johnston said that, again, they had up until 5 p.m. Eastern to opt out, and as we're recording this, Alzner, Sven Berchi, Mike Green, Travis Hamonic, Steve Kampfer, and Roman Polak are the players to opt out. You were saying that they're allowed to opt out, but that's without, any at fault or like maybe suspension or anything, right? So I guess they still can.
I would assume they still can, but who knows? Up until 5 p.m. Today or yesterday, Eastern, there was no penalties for anybody that wanted to sit the phase 3 and 4 out. But that doesn't mean that people will come back or once they're in there, maybe they don't like it and leave after that. Maybe they get monetary suspended. Maybe they get game suspension for when they do come back. I don't know how else you punish them after that, but
it's a tricky thing, right? Like, we've never been through anything like this. So I think I probably said this before, I do like how flexible the NHL is kind of being in this scenario. Yeah. We heard in the NBA one, the player went to get food from his delivery guy across the street, and I don't know what he was thinking, but I guess there was some food that he really, really needed, and now he's basically has to quarantine himself for 10 days.
Yeah, well, according to Twitter, the food that the NBA players were getting, they were likening it to the Fire Festival a few years back. It was just, these multi-million-dollar athletes are having like cheese on toast, that kind of thing. So
that would suck. I guess, did the players not like get into any agreement or paperwork, at least in terms of what's going in their bodies and the quality of the food? I don't know.
Not. Well, Disney or wherever they're at says, once the games actually start, the food will be better. But that kind of seems like a a poor excuse for what they're doing now, essentially.
Mm-hmm. The NHL also extends with Montreal 7 days for Max Domi to opt out. I don't get this. Are they going to discover a cure for diabetes within 10 days, Logan?
No, but maybe they're just waiting for more tests to see what could happen, where maybe they're looking for more expert opinions on if they get it. I still don't quite know what, like, I know for COVID, if your immune is compromised, you're at a higher risk. I don't exactly know what the logistics is of that, or how your immune system is compromised with type 1 diabetes either. So if they're just playing it safe, I can be okay with that.
I really, personally, I don't get it. It does affect the lungs. You're more diminished. And with type 1 diabetes, it kind of affects all the systems in the body. And I really, if you're asking me, I think he should step away from this. In my opinion, if you're asking me, he should do what's best for him and his family. And if he believes that this is the right thing to do, go ahead and play. But wow, I don't know. I don't like it. I rather him just not play.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they, like you said, he's not gonna get cured from diabetes in the next week or two. As far as we know, there's no cure for COVID. That's probably not for the next month or a week as well. So if you're unsure now, then nothing's really going to change in a week. So
before we get to the interviews and everything, the only other thing I kind of want to talk about, the Russian player signing. I guess the NHL has agreed now to let the players from the KHL and, of course, from other countries sign contracts and quite possibly play in the return to play action. Dan Milstein of Gold Star Agency of signing players has been really busy. Most recently locking up Ilya Sorokin with the Islanders, the goaltender Mikhail Grigorenko with the Blue Jackets. He's back with them. Romanov, big boost for the Canadians if they can get him in there. And of course, Datsuk in the KHL. I'm glad to hear he's still playing at his age. Players at our age playing, that's great. Yeah, and of course, I think it was Kaprizov for the Wild, and maybe I'm missing it, one or two, but this is interesting. I guess only because we're playing this late towards the playoffs that they've decided to kind of have more leniency. But usually they don't allow this, right? So,
well, they also in the new CBA got rid of the rule, the Ryan O'Reilly rule, as Johnston, I think, dubbed it, where if you were to play in a different league and then get signed, you'd have to go through waivers. So now that rule's out, I imagine it's more easier for these KHL people, or any other league for that matter, for these players to come in and just play immediately.
I like it. I've always been saying that I want, and we probably mentioned it time and time again, I'll mention right now, that I would love a Super League, just like they have in soccer, a World League, and have the top teams. And then this might help in terms of loaning players if there's quick contracts like this, and being a little bit more lenient in terms of being able to sign players quickly and then having them play on your team. So maybe this will make this slightly closer. I don't know.
Well, and a lot of these are like 1-year contracts. So I'm still curious exactly what that means. If it's just for this style tournament, or if it includes like the next year after that. So yeah, if for these players that are coming over who haven't played, or this may just get them to dip their toe in the water to see what it's actually like. And if they like it, they can continue on, or they can just go back home.
Yeah, I think a few of them are basically one-offs that are very short now. If they're going to be playing in this return to play action playoffs,
yeah,
and then kind of that they're like, not obviously some of the younger guys like Romanov, but they could technically be free agents like within a month, pretty much, right? Yeah. It's pretty interesting.
If they do well, they do well. So they get what? Usually what are these? $1 million to $1 million per contract.
Yeah.
If they do well, maybe they all of a sudden get 4 to 5, just off of a 20-point, 3-week showcase, right?
And have you noticed what I'm wearing? I just noticed that I'm wearing
all Philly.
Yeah. So I hope a lot of people from our hockey pool for the playoffs aren't listening to this. I know a few of you are, but I don't know. Is this considered a sleeper pick? But Philly is a bit of my sleeper pick, and I might pick them. I might not for the hockey pool because you only have so many picks you can use. But I think they're my sleeper pick to go all the way this year.
I guess I don't want to call them the sleeper pick any more than like a Chicago as a sleeper pick. In that, like, Chicago had a terrible year, but they have good players.
Yeah.
Same with Philly. They've had this year's not. I didn't think it was that bad, but the last couple of years have not been great. But they still have good players. So
I think their young players, like Provorov and some of the others, are really coming into their own now, and with their great veterans like Voracek and Giroux, and now even the younger player like Konechny.
Yeah.
And of course, between the pipes is so important. In Philly, that's been maybe an issue time and off again. But Carter Hart playing amazing this season. That could be the last piece that they're missing that could take them all the way.
Yeah, it could be another Matt Murray in another Pennsylvania team. Just that young goaltender with, they got a couple good defensemen back there as well. So sometimes that's all you need is a hot goalie for a short amount of time and a couple good defenders.
Yeah, so we will talk more about play-in round action with some great reporters coming up in a couple of weeks right before the play-in round. So stay tuned for that. We possibly will be doing a double episode for that week. So please enjoy that. Coming up next on the show, we have Matt Russell from his podcast, The Window. Enjoy. Now on the show is sports betting expert Matt Russell. He's been working for many years at one of our favorite places, Sportsnet, as a producer. He's currently a podcast host for The Window. It's a daily sports betting themed podcast. And you can hear more about that right now from Matt. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate having me on. Happy Canada Day to everybody out there.
You can reach him on Twitter at Mr. Russ Authentic, MRUSSAUTHENTIC. So I stumbled on that because I was like, yeah, it was Matt Russ Authentic, and I was thinking Mr.
M. Russ Authentic.
Yeah, perfect. And of course, your podcast can be found on Apple, Spotify, and of course all other podcatching platforms. Matt, before we get into the show, I like for fans to get a glimpse of our community, where we come from. A lot of us are in the media and stuff like that. So you've been a producer at Sportsnet. How did you get that role?
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into it, to be honest with you. I didn't go to school for it, so I'm not one of those people who went, to college and was thinking that they were going to be in, television or anything, any of media at all, really, actually. I started my first job out of university. I went to Brock University for sport management. My first job was with the Blue Jays in their corporate development. So like suit and tie, that whole thing, right? 9 to 5, only it was never really 9 to 5 because there was baseball that night that you had to be around for. So it was more like 9 to 9, and sort of kind of thought it was just going to be doing that for a while. And then I went from there to the Hamilton Tiger Cats and a company, sister company of theirs called MRX. And what they do is they produce a lot of media, video stuff, websites. Like their main contract was the CFL and all of the CFL team websites. And we randomly got this contract to do the DVDs, the championship DVDs for what was then called the BCS in college football in the States. And it was like a 1-year deal. I don't even know why we got it. We were this tiny company of literally 5 people in Hamilton. And we got this deal from Fox that we had to produce the DVDs for like the Rose Bowl, the Sugar Bowl, the Fiesta Bowl, and so on and so forth. And so we didn't really know what we were doing. I was the client services manager for that company at the time. So I was just basically a go-between between, clients and, the people who are actually doing stuff for our company, right? Like the web developers and graphic designers and all that sort of thing. And so we hired a guy by the name of Paul Griss to be a consultant, essentially, sort of guide us and, come in every once in a while and tell us what we were doing wrong, what we were doing right, and how to do it better. And he could tell that this project was way beyond anything that as far as my enjoyment levels anyway, way beyond anything else I was doing. And he was like, have you ever thought about getting into television? And I'm like, not really. I didn't go to school. I barely know which way to point the camera. And he said, well, there's such things as like editorial assistants and production assistants. And I think you'd be really good at that. And so he put in a good word for me over at Sportsnet. And that's how I got in there. And it was literally just cutting highlights on the row for, a few years, and then slowly moved my way up to a point where I was producing the opening for Sportsnet Central. So that first minute where, the sort of robot noises and lasers are coming in and, punny words and fast moving action, clips from the games, and obviously the voiceover from the anchor. And so I did that for, 5+ years, basically.
Then you decided to launch your podcast on sports betting, The Window. Tell us about doing so.
When you work in the media and you're sort of telling the same story over and over and over at night, I don't want to say you get burned out of it, but you kind of get burned out of it. And I had always been interested in sports betting from basically 19 years and on. So I started, like most other people, sort of, doing the pro line thing as soon as I was of age to be able to do that, and then move to the online scene and that, and so on and so forth. And my main thing, to be completely frank, is NFL and football and college sports. And that's just not something that Sportsnet covers. So I was sort of, not to be too dramatic about it, but living kind of a double life within this sports realm, where I would come to work every night at 6 p.m. and work on hockey stuff. Meanwhile, I would have football or basketball games on that I had been betting on the TV, and sort of balancing those two things every night. And people would come in to my edit suite and we would just chop it up for, 45 minutes to an hour, but never about the same stuff that a lot of people in the media talk about with regards to sports or hockey, or, to be more specific. Mm-hmm. So we'd be talking about point spreads and bad beats from the night before, and who do you like in the game tonight, and who do you have this weekend, and anything that you see sort of in the peripheral markets or anything like that. Like, it was a completely different conversation. And we would always kind of talk about, like, this should be a show. Like, why isn't this a show? And long story short, it never became a show by a Sportsnet. And so I just decided I'm going to start my own as I sort of shifted to be a professional bettor as my main source of income. I've always had that, like, kind of bug to get back into producing something, because I loved producing things, right? I love kind of taking nothing and then populating it and have something, allegedly entertaining come out of it. And so, I miss talking about sports in the way that those guys and I were talking sports every day. And so I was just like, this is fine what I'm doing now, but I'd love to do something where I'm actually still getting creative, and I'm not just, plowing through bets and working the numbers every day, putting in bets, watching games, and so on and so forth. It's like, I want to be creative and I want to be able to do something. And that's basically what I do over at the window now.
When it comes to sports betting, what are big factors in games that you sway your bets?
Well, to be honest with you, it's different for every sport, right? Mm-hmm. But at its core, I'm big on sort of reading the market, right? And at the end of the day, you have to, the best bets, whether they win or lose, are whether they're deemed to have value, right? Positive expected value, right? In the industry, you'll see a term called EV, plus EV, minus EV. That means positive or negative expected value. And so if you can see something in the market, in a line, in the odds, that would suggest to you that, you're making a good bet, you kind of have to put the result of the game, because this is sports and it's unpredictable and things are going to happen, and a team can outshoot somebody 40-20 and still end up losing, in hockey parlance. For me, it's understanding that there's never a right or wrong answer. It's only good value or bad value. And we'll get to that as far as talking about the hockey playoffs coming up, knock on wood. Mm-hmm. But everything is going to come down to good value or bad value, because I don't know that anybody, and more so than ever before, has a right or a wrong answer to who are going to win these games, right? And anybody who tells you they know who's going to win the game, and that just because this team won yesterday, that was going to be the answer, that was going to be the team that won, isn't necessarily the case. That's the team that won on that night, right? And, we'll see the next night how well they do, but did you get good value on the price? And sometimes that means paying money for something, and sometimes that means you're getting good odds and you're getting paid back money on your odds, right? Plus mm-hmm. odds or minus odds. So yeah, as far as hockey is concerned, I mean, from a statistics standpoint, I would look at, obviously puck possession, scoring chance creation versus, scoring chances, against that kind of stuff. But for me, I don't usually bet on the regular season. I'm busy doing, I kind of treat everything in a seasonal way, right? So we'll bet NFL football and college football is one season for me. And if I started thinning myself out and betting NBA regular season, NHL regular season, there's just no way that I'm going to be able to do that, right? And then college basketball season will start up, and I'll get more serious about that once football season dies back down. Then once college basketball season's done, great. NBA playoffs and Stanley Cup playoffs, and we're good to go there. And at that point, there has been a statistical buildup of information that's happened throughout the regular season, and also a narrative buildup. And that was the best part of doing all of that narrative stuff at Sportsnet with hockey, and sort of having to follow along every day, is that I always knew what the narrative was and how people felt about different teams. And I could suss out teams that were overrated and teams that were underrated, right? And that's the key to positive expected value and negative expected value. It's essentially a fancier way of saying overvalued or undervalued, right?
When people are building up that kind of niche storyline within teams and their value changes, is that when you basically go switch up and go the other way, and Absolutely. Then you pretty much have the better value, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, if you don't believe in a certain goaltender, right. I've trained myself essentially over the years, and that's not, necessarily hockey. It's all sports, is to kind of immediately think of the opposite of somebody's take. Right. And I'm sure you and your listeners have favorites or the opposite of favorites about people on air who, you may think don't know what they're talking about, or that guy's an idiot, or blah, blah, blah. And it's sort of like that, where you go, okay, if everybody's feeling the same way about something, there's going to be value thinking the opposite. And that might be everybody thinks this player isn't any good, or this goaltender is not capable of making a run in the playoffs, because everybody believes that until they see it, right? So, a guy like Murray for Pittsburgh, it's like, well, he wasn't capable of doing it until he did it. And now we all believe in him. And is he any better necessarily as a goaltender than the kid in Colorado, that's essentially, I think, looks like he'll replace Grubauer. Is he any better? No, probably not, right? Is that, especially these days, goaltenders are all pretty much the same, right? I mean, Carey Price is like the 30th, statistically, like the 30th best goaltender in the league. Mm-hmm. And once we've now that we've hit that area and this point in time where it isn't the same four guys making the Stanley Cup Finals every year, you sort of have to understand now that all of these guys are the same. And there's a reason, goaltenders aren't going in the first round of drafts, and one goalie's good for 3 years and then all of a sudden he's out of the league, and vice versa. You've never heard of this guy, now he's taking a team to a run to the finals. And so these are all just sort of micro examples of picking something out and either and finding a middle ground, right? Because everything's always way worse than it is, or way better than it is. And the truth is, it's somewhere in the middle. And so if you're going to give me a good price on a guy that you don't believe in, I'll take that. And if you're going to give me a good price in a guy, that you don't believe in, I'm going to take that too. And that effectively all comes down to, again, overrated, underrated, and expected value, plus or minus.
Mm-hmm. When these companies that are making the betting lines, do they get into the storylines a lot and then change their odds that much? Is that what they're doing?
Well, essentially, for those of you out there who don't, necessarily know how the lines are made, mm-hmm. The ideal for them is that it's a market, right? So it gets bet into place. It's no different than any other market where there's a price for something, and if everybody thinks that's a cheap price, they're all going to buy it, and the company's going to raise the price on it. And vice versa, if nobody buys your thing, it's probably overpriced, right? And so if you have two teams that are of equal value in your mind, you just put them up at an equal price. But if one team just starts getting bet on, piled up, the line then moves, right? The odds move. And of course, hockey is very much a money line based betting proposition, right? And there is no point spread necessarily in hockey. Sure, there's the run or the goal line, right? It's a run line in baseball that's plus or minus 1.5. And we can talk about that too. But by and large, you're betting who's going to win that game, right? And so you're doing so at a price. And we'll talk about, series prices and stuff, because right now we don't have any prices for games.
Yep.
Right? Which is, not strange because we don't have a schedule yet, right? The NBA came out later with their plan, but came up with a schedule quicker than the NHL did. And so we don't have games necessarily priced, but we have series that are going to be priced mm-hmm. right now. And we can talk about it if you want, but there are, for me, there's 4 essential websites that I use as a Canadian bettor. And 3 of them have series prices up for the NHL right now. And there is some drastic differences between the websites as to what prices are available. So depending on who you like, one website might have that team favored in a series and the other team favored on another website. And so you're looking at these websites and it gives you as good an example as any that nobody really knows what to believe.
Yeah.
Right. And part of that pricing might just be more people on this website like the Islanders, and more people on this other website happen to bet, or the bigger bets came on the Islanders on one website, and the other website has the Panthers getting more of the bets, and they've had to move their lines accordingly. Well, for us, if we have accounts on all these websites, it doesn't really matter who we use, as long as if we're using everyone. If I like the Panthers, I'll go bet on that site. But if I like the Islanders, I'll go bet on that other site mm-hmm. because I'm searching for the best price and I'm looking for the best value for what I think is going to happen.
So you have an account on all the different betting platforms and you're prepared to make a bet depending on what gets you the best value for what you think is going to happen.
Absolutely. And so essentially what I'll tell your listeners is, for me, there's 4 sites that, as a Canadian sports bettor, I would use. And that's Bet365, that's CoolBet, that's Sports Interaction, and Pinnacle. All 4 of those websites, you're not dealing with Caribbean islands or anything like that. You're dealing with a more European base, okay? So it's easier to get your money out right? It's easy to get money into any of these websites, but it's easier to get your money out in all of those websites, right? And they all provide different odds, even sort of deeper into the derivative markets than just simply, who's going to win. And so, I might as well give you that example of the Islanders in Florida, where if you go to Bet365, Florida is the favorite. If you go to Sports Interaction, Florida is the favorite. So their series price is minus 115 on 365 and minus 122 on Sports Interaction. Mm-hmm. But if you go to CoolBet, for whatever reason, the Islanders are actually pretty heavily favored, higher than those two numbers, at minus 125. And of course, all of that means is that you have to spend 125 to make 100, right? Mm-hmm. Whether that's dollars or cents or however whatever multiple you use, that's what we're talking about. And if you go up and down, there's at least, according to my notes here, I've got 5 different series that, depending on who you like, the other side is as good or better of odds. In that, essentially, if you just had an infinite amount of money, you could bet on both sides and win money no matter what. It's like a free money circumstance.
Let's get into the matchups.
Let's do it.
Like you were talking, let's just keep continuing with the Islanders in Florida. You were saying that a few of them have Florida. Islanders are team 7, basically. Florida's team 10, I believe. It's just interesting that when you're telling me this, that Florida seems more favorited, at least for a couple of them.
But one of the key things to remember is, with regards to betting on sports, standings, rankings, anything like that, anything that is a little bit more circumstantial is meaningless, mm-hmm. right? So instantly throw out, like I wouldn't have been able to tell you, who the 7th team is, the 10th team, because all of that stuff is essentially 1 point here or there, right? Obviously once you get to sort of the 5th team and like would that be the 16th or 20th team? No, the math is escaping me at the moment.
Yeah. 5 versus 12 what I mean? Right now.
Like, yeah. So like, I guess Pittsburgh and Montreal, like I'm looking at the odds, right? Pittsburgh and Montreal have the greatest discrepancy in their odds, right? Yep. And so, and that's because, they're significantly different in the standings. But other than that, maybe Toronto and Columbus a little bit, but, everything else is within, say, 5 to 6 points or lower. And when you're talking about a league that plays their regular season differently than their playoffs, in that you have 4-on-4 overtime, you're giving out points for shootout, results. We're not talking about apples and apples here. We're talking about apples and oranges. So it's, Florida, or, I think you said the Islanders have a better record or have a better standing.
Yep.
But Florida is favored more. Why? I haven't looked deep into that standing, but that might be entirely based on the Islanders having more shootout victories, or, more overtime and shootouts, because we're not playing 4-on-4 overtime. We're not having a shootout. So none of that stuff matters. So I would imagine that maybe Florida has a better 5-on-5 rating in some of the more, deeper analytics, let's say the advanced analytics. I would assume, if that is the case, that's why Florida would be favored, right? Because you have to rely more on 5-on-5 mm-hmm. in the playoffs, right? So to me, not that the Islanders and the Panthers aren't high profile, but the most interesting one for me is Calgary and Winnipeg. Because if you look at the odds for Calgary and Winnipeg, on Bet365, Calgary is minus 115. That's by far the best in the market if you like Calgary, right? So meaning, of course, so you have to bet 115 to make 100. Well, on CoolBet, Calgary is up to minus 154. Well, if you're going to bet on Calgary, which would you rather, how much would you rather spend? Would you rather spend 154 or would you rather spend 115? Obviously, you'd rather spend 115. But of course, on the flip side on CoolBet is Winnipeg is plus 130. Now, of course, what that means is all you need is 100 to win back 130. So you're getting more than you're betting to bet on Winnipeg, which isn't the case back over at 365. right? With 365 to bet on Calgary at minus 115, that means Winnipeg, you have to actually spend 105, minus 105 to win back 100. So why would I want to spend why would I want to spend 105 to win 100 when I can spend 100 to win 130 over on Winnipeg? And I can't tell you necessarily who's going to win that series, right? That's not what I do. And especially now, because, after all this time, all of these are as unpredictable as they come. My point is that Calgary is considerably better priced over at this one site, and Winnipeg is considerably better priced over at another site. So whatever you think is the team that you want to bet on, go ahead and do it. And this is a perfect example also of if you had a bunch of money, you could make money without having to do anything on this, right? If you took $115 and bet it on Calgary and they win, you get $100. Well, if you took that $100 and you bet it on Winnipeg and they win, you get 130, which of course covers and then some, the 115 that you lost on Calgary. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So you're making $15 without having to do anything. So that's how skewed these odds are on all these different websites. And it's the same case for, Pittsburgh and Montreal is a good example of that, because over at CoolBet, they have Pittsburgh at minus 161. But at 365, they have Montreal at plus 195. So plus 195, of course, is more than 161. So if you won, 195 and you lost 161, you're making money right there. And you're doing so without having to put any money at risk, right? And so you can play with the math, here and there to sort of decide how you want, what you want, which team you want to win, right? You can tweak it so that, okay, if Pittsburgh wins, I make a couple of bucks, but if Montreal wins, I don't lose anything, right? That's just a matter of sort of playing around with math formulas and stuff, which, is tricky to talk about over the air necessarily, but is a thing that is available to us. And normally that wouldn't be the case, because all of these websites would have a more concrete understanding of what the odds were, right? They'd be in more agreement, essentially. But because everybody's kind of like, I don't really know what to expect, all of these discrepancies exist. And so if you just put a little bit of money into each one of these websites, you can pick and choose the best of the odds for each individual series. Which, because these games are going to be on neutral sites, the series odds is going to reflect the game odds way more than they normally would, right? Because you start having to factor in home ice advantage as each, the series go back and forth, and it skews the odds up and down from there. Well, for the first time ever, everything's on a neutral, on neutral ice, essentially. And even if, say, Edmonton is playing at home, there's not going to be any fans in the stands. So, and there's no travel under, those circumstances or anything like that, right? And it's slightly more familiar, but all of the quote-unquote comforts of home no longer exist. So all of these series prices are going to be more reflective in game prices. But if these websites are not able to agree on what the odds are supposed to be, every night there's going to be options to pick and choose which team you want based on how good of a value they are, right? And so I should mention that a really important thing with regards to not necessarily handicapping the game, but betting the games, right? So handicapping is figuring out which team is better and, or which team is going to win more frequently. But it's also more frequently, are they going to win relative to their price, and understanding what the different prices mean, right? And so, for instance, we talk about that Calgary and Winnipeg example, and I think that's a really good example, because that Calgary price, the best available price at minus 115, it essentially means that they're going to win that game 53.5% of the time, or I should say win that series, because it's the series price. But they're saying Calgary's going to win that series 53.5% of the time, right? So if you think they're going to win it 60% of the time, that's a really good bet, right? If you think they're going to win it 70% of the time, that's a phenomenal bet, right? That's, the higher you think a percentage that they're going to win, the better that bet becomes, right? Now it's up to you to decide how you're going to make that percentage, right? A lot of people do it very math heavily, and some people just do it by watching games and, just by eyeballing it, essentially, right? And on the flip side, the Winnipeg side that had plus 130 as odds, right? That just means that they only need to win 43.5% of the time for that to be a break-even proposition. Mm-hmm. So if you think that's a true 50-50 series, you know, why wouldn't you bet on Winnipeg and just take your chances, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. Because that price is telling you that all you have to do is be right 50% of the time, and you're going to make 6.5% over the course of a long period of time. Now, the unfortunate thing about sports is that these games happen once. These series happen once. Yeah. And if you're wrong, you're wrong. But if you're doing this over a long period of time and you bet on 1,000 series over the course of your lifetime and you're making these good bets, right, you're going to be right in relativity to those percentages, you know, more often than not, right? And if something happens 50% of the time, but you're getting odds to do it, right? If you and I just started flipping coins right now, and I started giving you $130 for wins, and you had gave me $100 for losses, you'd sit here and flip coins with me all day, right? Yep. And so if you're handicapping these series, you know, especially that one that's so close to being kind of an even Steven proposition, a coin flip, if you will, then making that bet is the right bet, you know, every single time, even if it doesn't get paid off necessarily. And that's what I meant earlier by saying, you know, you're evaluating based on value, not by necessarily, you know, whether you were right or not. Because let's be honest, this is hockey, this is sports, and it's, you know, incredibly unpredictable, and now more than ever.
When you're looking at these series, you're probably going to be looking at maybe the one game in, seeing where they are after. I'm guessing the series lines will be very different after that game.
Sure, yeah, and the series lines change after every game, right? So obviously if you win that game, you become a considerable favorite in the series. And normally it's a pretty decent play to bet on the team that lost game one to win the series. Not because they do it the majority of the time, but all they have to do is, again, similar to our coin flip, you know, comparison, you're going to get good odds on that team, and all they have to do, right, is win 4 out of 6 games, which, you know, isn't necessarily easy, but it's something that they can do more often than maybe the odds would reflect, right? But in this case, you know, first round here, tighter series, 5-game series, going down 1-0 is going to be way more significant because of how short the series are. And like I said, I'm more likely to believe what I see in that first game than I am ever before. So I will probably be staying away from that, you know, boosted up odds team to come back from being down 1-0 in that series than I ever would be before. And so for me, I'll pick and choose the series plays to make. I will, you know, need a really good price on anything to bet the series. And I'll be watching like a hawk in those first games to see who has and see who doesn't. And, you know, if the game goes to overtime or something and both teams look like they are, you know, up and ready to play, you know, that's a different story, right? And everything is based on price too, right? So if, you know, using the Panthers and the Islanders as an example, if the Panthers win that first game and the Islanders, if I'm getting 3-1 on my money on the Islanders coming back to win that series, then, you know, yeah, I'll take that, especially if the game was close, went to overtime, like there was no discernible difference between the two teams. You know, I'll take my chances on something that only needs to, you know, work a third of the time for me to be profitable, right? And it's hard for people to understand that, like, I'm doing this long term, right? This isn't the last bet I'm ever going to make in my life. As long as I'm on the sort of mathematically correct side over the long term, it's going to work out, right? Like I bet the Blue Jackets to beat the Lightning last year. It wasn't because I thought the Blue Jackets were going to beat the Lightning. It's because the odds were such that it was in the realm of possibility higher than the market was giving that option credit for, right? Yeah. And so it was like a pleasant surprise. It was a bet that I was fully ready to lose, but it was a pleasant surprise to see them win because I didn't really expect them to do it. It's just a bet that I had to make relative to the odds and the percentages that that I thought were going to work out. Mm-hmm. There's not necessarily a series for me right now that jumps out that because again, Montreal is the closest one, but even those odds aren't high enough necessarily for me to jump on Montreal. Maybe come round 2 when there's these teams that have had these actual playoff series, back against the wall type deal, versus the ones that have kind of been doing the round robin tune-up type setup. Because I'm not sure that any of these teams really care about being the 1 seed, right? They just need 3 games to get on par with the teams that have been kind of going hard after it for a week, right?
Right now, I would say a lot of people are thinking the Leafs are maybe even the most favorited out of all the series in the play-in round. So would you pretty much lean already on Columbus winning? And if, say, the Columbus wins the first game, do you lean maybe more for than the Leafs because of the odds? Especially if Matthews doesn't look great.
Yeah, I mean, that one to me, I will be staying away from that from a series price standpoint. It's the closest that is sort of agreed upon by all the 3 sites that I referenced that have numbers up, right? Yeah. So, they have Columbus as plus 140, plus 145, and plus 147, right? Yeah. So not a ton between the 2, and certainly not in the same realm as Montreal, with that one site that has plus 195 and another site that has 168. So yeah, according to the numbers, or according to the odds, they're Toronto's the second most likely team to advance. But you also have to remember these odds aren't again built on likelihood; they were built on a market. So these websites that are accessed by Canadians, by hockey fans, like who else is betting on hockey a month before these start other than hockey fans, and especially Canadian? So you're never going to get a good price on the Leafs ever, right? Because the money always goes to the Leafs, because why would anybody bet on the Blue Jackets, right? People are driven by fandom more than they're driven necessarily by research or intellect. Now, I'm not saying that means you should bet on Columbus. I'm just saying that you're never going to get a positive EV, a positive expected value, on a bet on the Maple Leafs. You're just not. And so that sucks for Maple Leafs fans who want to throw a couple bucks on their team to win. And it's the same thing with the futures markets too, right? So that means to win the Stanley Cup, that means to win the East, those sorts of things, right? You never get value on the positive for the Leafs, because the market doesn't need the money, so they can price it down as low as they, within reason, they can price it as low as they want, right? Because they know you're going to buy it. You're going to buy the Leafs Stanley Cup ticket every, October before the season starts, because this might be the year. Or every time the playoffs start, you're going to kick another $20 onto the Leafs at 8-1 or 10-1 to win this or that, because they know they're getting that money, right? So it's the same thing with Montreal, a little bit to a lesser extent, of course. Now that I'm looking at it, Edmonton also heavily favored over Chicago. Same sort of deal, right? People want to bet on Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl. They want to bet on those guys. Now, to me, that's a really interesting option for the Blackhawks if you're getting the right price. And there's one price that's plus 145, which is essentially what we said is the same thing with Columbus. Now, to me, if we're talking plus 145, I much rather bet on Chicago to beat Edmonton at plus 145 than Columbus to beat Toronto at plus 145. Right? How do you feel about that? Do you think there's a better chance that the Blackhawks beat the Oilers than the Blue Jackets beat the Leafs?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, especially with their history. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're getting that price, that same price, you don't have to bet on all of the series. That's the one advantage that we have, right? They can change the prices, they move things around, they limit how much we bet, they do this, they do that. But what we're allowed to do is we're allowed to decide what we bet on and what we don't bet on, right? So this is a perfect example of 2 teams that are priced the same way, and I would much rather take the Blackhawks than the Blue Jackets. And again, I'm somebody who bet the Blue Jackets last year against the Lightning, and it worked out. So I have nothing negative to say about the Blue Jackets as a team sort of in its entirety. Obviously a considerably different team this year than they were last year. So, that's a factor as well.
Matt, thank you for coming on the show.
Oh man, I was happy to. Anytime. Really, cool. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for inviting me.
Cool. And again, you can reach him on Twitter at mrussauthentic. His podcast is The Window. You can find it on Apple, Spotify, and other podcatching platforms. Matt, thank you for coming on the show. Matt is the real deal, a professional sports bettor. He has a tremendous love and knowledge for sports betting. I want to let you know that you can hear more of our conversation. Check out our bonus episode that will be dropping in a few days. More on sports betting with Matt Russell. Check that out. Next up, Mason Black, a teacher who spends most of his free time using his analytical brain on creating helpful tools and a great NHL app, which is most helpful for all you fantasy hockey players. Now to chat, we have Mason Black. He's the creator of the app, NHL Rank King app, and also the PNHLe. You can reach him on Twitter at NHL Rank King. Welcome to the show, Mason.
Thanks very much, Peter.
We will talk all about your app and, of course, a little bit of the draft and how that went. But I wanted to get a little bit into, so you played NCAA hockey as a goalie. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I played for Lake Forest College, a Division III team just north of Chicago. So we spent a lot of our time in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And I went to Chicago when I was about 17 years old. So I was a little bit on the younger side. And played all 4 years there, and decided to come back to Canada afterwards and became a teacher.
It's fantastic. You were telling me there was an interesting story when you let in a goal. Was it like your first game?
Yeah, it was my very first game. I can't even remember who we were playing. I remember it was in Minnesota. I'm going to say St. Thomas or Gustavus Adolphus or something like that. And apparently they have a tradition there that the first goal of the game in a head-to-head series, they throw fish and tennis balls onto the ice. So I was getting pelted with tennis balls, and I see these dead fish coming onto the ice, and it was certainly an eye-opener. So I think we ended up losing 7-3 or something like that. And I'd like to think that the fish maybe threw me off my game a little bit, but wasn't the result we were looking for.
Is that a tradition, or were the fans just ready and prepared with these fish? Like, what's going on?
Oh
over
yeah,
there?
I'm thinking it's a lot like Nashville, where they bring in the catfish. Like there were quite a few that hit the ice, so they must have snuck them in and had pack of tennis balls under their winter jackets or something. I don't know, but I wasn't expecting it. I had no idea that this was going to happen, so it was kind of an eye opener.
It's crazy. And did anybody on the team or mention to you that this might happen, or that they're used to this kind of thing happening?
No, I think all of us were surprised. It wasn't a division team, or they weren't in our conference. So okay. I think we play them every probably 3 or 4 years. And this happened to be that one time. So I think we were all just stunned, just standing on the ice, looking around going, what is going on here?
Wow, that's sounds crazy. How did you get into developing it, and becoming an app developer?
My background, so when I was in university in Lake Forest College, my degree is in computer science and math. And when I went into teaching, I primarily became a math teacher. So it had been a long time not doing much computer programming and app development or website development or whatever. And a couple of teachers retired and kind of forced my hand into that area. So what I wanted to do was to keep things relevant, to try to keep students engaged into interesting projects. So I really wanted to learn about creating apps because I figured that would capture their attention.
Mm-hmm.
So probably over the last maybe 10 years or so, I've been really focusing my attention in the classroom on developing different types of apps and different projects where students can get engaged and hopefully learn some life skills along the way that they can take with them, whether or not they end up going into computer programming or go to university in some sort of IT capacity. I'm hoping that the things that we learn in the classroom are transferable to many different places.
How does your app work? Explain your app.
Yeah, so the NHL Rank King was, like I mentioned, when I was kind of forced into teaching computer programming, I took a summer and tried to relearn all of the skills that I had lost in the about 10 years since graduating university. So what I wanted to do was to try to learn those skills through something that interests me, which is fantasy hockey. So I started small. I just had a little game inside of it called Who'd You Rather. And in Who'd You Rather, two players will pop up on the screen. So it could be someone like Austin Matthews and Jack Eichel. And you have to choose which one you would rather have on your fantasy team. And based on who you choose, so if you said, I would rather have Austin Matthews, then he increases his ranking inside the database that then creates an overall ranking throughout the NHL. So you have probably 200 NHL forwards and they're all ranked. It's dynamic, so it happens every single day. There are thousands of votes that are cast each day, and the rankings change almost instantaneously.
Wow, that sounds pretty cool. I have some crazy ideas too, but I'm not going to let everybody know about this. How long did it take you to create it?
It's been a work in progress over really the last about 3 years. And really, anytime I come up with an idea that I want to implement, I start programming it into the app, and then I release that so that the public is able to access those as well. So like I said, it started with this little mini game called Who'd You Rather, and then it started to get into, well, I need a player profile, and I need to start taking a look at prospects, and I need to start taking a look at some advanced stats. So you can go in and your favorite team, let's say is the Toronto Maple Leafs, you can quickly go in and see a list of all of their prospects and the points that they're posting across a variety of leagues around the world. There's many different other features. So I like to focus on daily fantasy. So you can take a look at tonight's lineup or starting goalies, and hopefully that'll be back up sooner than later with COVID-19.
Yeah.
There's always league stats so that you can pick and choose the different leagues. So I can compare all CHL, and it'll actually filter all of the point totals for players across WHL, the Q, and the OHL. Or you could even say, I want to take a look at the SHL versus the KHL and who's scoring over there. And maybe that gives you a better sense of who's playing well and some of the prospects that might be jumping across the pond over the course of the next couple of years. There's live stats. So you can take a look every night that there are games on in the OHL. You can actually see who's posting stats, across the Q, NCAA, so that night it just gives you a quick snapshot that Alexis Lafreniere posted 5 points tonight. So just gives you an idea of who's hot and who's not.
And where do we find and download your app?
The app is inside Apple's App Store and the Google Play Store. So hopefully it's available on most devices that are out there. It's a hobby, so it's not don't expect sort of a brilliant, dynamic team of hundreds of app developers. It's just something when I have time, I try to put a little bit of attention into it and update some of the bugs that you might find. But hopefully people enjoy it, and I've gotten a lot of great feedback so far.
That's fantastic. So check out that NHL Rank King app on Google and Apps Store.
Right.
Also, what is PNHLe? Explain to the listeners.
So a few years ago, I was taking my master's through the University of New Brunswick. and I did it entirely online. And one of the courses that I had was it was a math course, and it was all about problem solving. And partway through the semester, the designation for the course switched from online course to part online and part in person. Well, I live about 1,000 miles away from New Brunswick, so there was no way that I was going to be able to make the in-class sections. So I made an arrangement with my professor, and he said, okay, you can work on something, has to be math related, have to solve a problem. And in the back of my mind for the longest time, I've been sort of planning this idea that I want to create a stat that sort of projects how an OHL player is doing this year and their point production, how that would eventually translate down the road as their optimal level in the NHL. So that was kind of the brainchild of mine. And I was very fortunate to have time to kind of work it out and have someone that was able to look over my work and give me some ideas or perhaps different algorithms to try to use inside of the statistics. So that's the idea. PNHLe is just a projection of a prospect's point potential at the NHL level. It's a little different than NHLe, if you've heard of the NHL equivalency stat before, that basically projects next year. It doesn't take into consideration things like how old the prospect is at any given time. So you can imagine someone like Alexis Lafreniere, if he spent another year in the queue for some reason, not that I think he's going to, that his NHLe is going to jump up next year just for the basic fact that we should expect him to have more points compared to this past season. Whereas PNHLe sort of creates an equivalency so that the age is one of the most important factors. So his PNHLe should ideally stay the same. Now, there are some little warts inside of the stat itself. One of those being it doesn't take into consideration line mates. So if you had a guy like Dmitry Zavgorodny, who is Alexis Lafreniere's line mate, you can imagine that his PNHLe is going to look a lot better simply for the fact that he's on the ice with the best player in the CHL. So he's going to pick up a lot of points basically just by being on the ice with him. Other things that doesn't take into consideration is time on ice. And that's a big one. So you can imagine if a guy, for instance, Jack Quinn, who's expected to be in the first round of this year's draft, last year he was playing third line minutes with the Ottawa 67s. So his PNHLe is going to look pretty abysmal compared to what it is this year, simply for the fact that he got a lot more ice time and prime deployment on power play. I hope that gives an explanation about what it is, a little bit long-winded.
No, for sure. That was a pretty good explanation. I've got like who you're playing with, the ice time, what type of ice time. Obviously, they all matter. So, and of course, that'll help you produce more points or not, depending.
For sure. Yeah, and really what I did was I just took a look at players that are in the NHL right now and their historical totals in the leagues, the development leagues that they were playing in. So I take a look at 11 different leagues and I say, for instance, maybe a guy like Sidney Crosby, when he was playing in the queue and he was putting up this many points per game at this exact age level, that gives me one data point. And if you do that for the hundreds, if not thousands of players that have come across the NHL over the last 20 years, it gives you a pretty distinct pattern of what point production will eventually lead to at the NHL level. The one thing to take into consideration, though, is that it's a fantasy stat, so it shouldn't be used for an evaluation of how good a prospect is, and I would never create my draft analysis based simply on PNHLe.
All right, a little curveball here for you then. The year before Austin Matthews came, he played in the Swiss League, and would your app be able to foretell how Matthews would play coming out of the Swiss League?
The Swiss League, I do not have an equivalency factor for, simply because there just aren't enough players that came from the Swiss League. Now that may be changing, and especially this year, if the CHL is postponed for a significant amount of time, and a lot of these top end prospects don't have a place to play. I could see them moving over to leagues like the Swiss leagues, and it might give us a better equivalency. So that is one of the 11 leagues. Sorry, it's not one of the 11 leagues that I take a look at for PNHLe.
I got you, Mason. I got you.
All right.
All right. So let's get a little bit into the draft lottery, and hopefully your app or yourself can, maybe figure out who might be drafted. Of course, the LA Kings moved up in the draft lottery with the opportunity to draft second overall. Red Wings, technically based upon final standings, they dropped a few spots, now selecting fourth. And the Senators, maybe they slightly dropped two because they were roughly supposed to get second or third. Now they're getting third and fifth. So what does your app say? Who do you believe the Kings will draft with the second overall?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I honestly believe that the Kings don't know right now who they're going to select. And the one thing that I think a lot of these teams are going to be looking for is that if the draft is held in, let's say, October, late October, maybe early November, a lot of these prospects might find a different place to play, like the NLA and Switzerland, or move over to Finland or Sweden, or who knows, maybe even the KHL. And if that's the case, having, an extra month or two to analyze these prospects, especially playing against grown men in professional leagues, might change the current standing of many of these prospects. So I think right now, if the Kings were selecting, I think they would go with Quinton Byfield. That would be my gut. He actually finished out of over 8,000 different prospects outside of the NHL. Quinton Byfield finished first in PNHLe this year, even ahead of Alexis Lafreniere. And you might say, well, hold on. Does that mean that Byfield's a better prospect? Not necessarily. Lafreniere put up more consistent numbers. He's been over 100, a very rare instance in the last 3 years. And this is Quinton Byfield's first time that he's been a PNHLe above 100. So they're pretty close. They're pretty tight. You might say, well, hold on. I thought Alexis Lafreniere finished with a higher points per game than Quinton Byfield, and you'd certainly be right. But because Quinton Byfield's age, he's about eight months younger, that's where the equivalency factor for age comes into play.
Yeah, Byfield looks huge. And I would think that he would just keep growing, given his age, of course.
Certainly. And I think if he's able to utilize his size, which he hasn't really entirely filled that role yet. And I think, in terms of development, if they can figure out a way to get him to be sort of the next Lindros, his ceiling is unlimited. I don't really foresee any other players in the NHL that really have his skill set quite yet. He actually reminds me a little bit of Kopitar. So who better to, have him play underneath than learning from one of the best centers in the game?
For sure. All right, then we move over to the next few picks, and Ottawa Senators basically getting the third and the fifth overall picks. This should be a great turning point in their franchise if they can draft the right guys. Since you thought Byfield would go maybe second, I'm guessing probably Ottawa Senators with a third go with Stützle. Yeah,
I think that's a gimme. It might be one of the easiest picks in the entire draft outside of placeholder E, whoever ends up winning that. But yeah, so I think Stützle, he's dynamic. So you're thinking top end ceiling, he could be another Patrick Kane. Whether or not he hits that, he's already shown the dynamic skill sets in the German DEL, and his ceiling, I think, is almost unlimited as well. So he's got a lot of growing to do, and he could potentially step into the NHL next year.
Mason, thank you for coming on the show. Again, you can reach him on Twitter at NHL Rank King. It was great having you on the show, Mason.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate having an opportunity to talk to you.
I love having Mason on the show. You You can tell his passion for hockey and analytics working together and transferring now from school to making some original applications. That's it for this episode of Jablam Sports Hockey. I hope you enjoyed it. Check out the next few episodes coming soon. We'll talk more about the return to play, and we'll have 2 huge play-in round preview episodes coming up with 1 million guests. You won't want to miss it. Then we'll get into more interesting match-up series episodes as we get into this year's playoffs. Cross your fingers, folks. Go to Jablam Sports Hockey, see all our podcasts, and even game notes for each episode. You'll get info and tidbits about all the things we mentioned in this show. Please subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Click on the 3 dots in your podcasting app and share this episode with 3 friends. If you want to contact us or have any questions or ideas for the show, you can follow me on Twitter at Russian98, RUSSIAN 98, or the entire team at Jablam Sports. You can also use the hashtag Jablam Sports, that's JABLAM Sports, or go to our contact page on our website, jablamsports.com/contact. If you like wrestling, go check out our new wrestling podcast, Pro Wrestling Explode, presented by our team at Jablam Sports. It's where Joey Pepperoni and I get into AEW and WWE, and we recap, analyze, and current matches, storylines, pay-per-views. Thank you, everyone. This week's shout-out goes to Roger Peterson. I've known him for over 10 years now, working at City News. That man does everything, and he's one of the most down-to-earth people I know. I want to thank him for always being a great role model to myself and everybody out there, and a great friend. And to all our listeners, I'm giving you a virtual hug. Stay healthy. Listen, be yourself, and stay strong.